very warm welcome to everyone on this webinar this morning. SoCI 2024, where are we now? My name is Dave Cohen and I'll be hosting you for the next hour or so. I'd like to first start off by acknowledging that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all working from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of the Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connections to the lands and waters, particularly of New South Wales. A big warm welcome to our all-star cast this morning. A great pleasure to have with us again Hamish Hansford, the Deputy Secretary of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Group, Dr. Gav Schneider, the CEO of the Risk to Solutions Group of companies, and Leanne Close, our Chief Executive of Government and Strategy at Risk to Solution. Just a bit of housekeeping this morning. The Q&A box is available. Please post your questions in there throughout the session and we'll try and get to as many as we can. We've got a wonderful audience in today, so no doubt a lot of questions coming in. The aim of this webinar is to provide pragmatic ideas that you can take back to your organizations to address some of the challenges you might be facing, aligning them with the legislation. And if you need any help with that, Risk to Solution is just a phone call away. Sorry, couldn't resist the plug. SoCI 2024, where are we now? This is a pertinent question given that the date is fast approaching for your critical infrastructure risk management program submissions. Much has evolved since the legislation was first created, both in our economy and geopolitically. The legislation itself has evolved tremendously in the amount of information available, particularly on the CISC website, to help organizations navigate their way to what really should just be good risk management. Which leads me to my first question, which I'll throw to Hamish first, if that's okay. And with that, Gav and Leanne, please feel free to jump in at any stage as well. So Hamish, if I could pass the mic through to you first. Since SoCI was first conceived, we all know that the threat landscape has changed tremendously since then. What are you most worried about? And we all know that how we got here is not necessarily how we're going to get there, but what are you most worried about going forward?
Well, I think you're right. In the short few years since SoCI was legislated, we have seen a deterioration in our threat environment. I think the biggest change since the Act being passed is on the 8th of February, we saw Volt Typhoon and Five Eyes calling out the PRC, People's Republic of China, pre-positioned for destructive attack on American infrastructure, and that they had been there for up to 5 years, and that Australia and indeed New Zealand, for those who work across the Tasman, actually have the same vulnerabilities. And so that is a defining feature, I think, of 2024. And every day I speak to industry, just like you do, Dave, and everything from cyclones to mass weather events, floods, physical issues, trusted insiders, and increasingly supply chain issues, all are issues that people have to worry about in 2024 and beyond. But I think the big change is the cyber environment continues to deteriorate.
And that really provides me a great segue to my next question. Lee, before I throw to Gav, if I could just rope you in here. To Hamish's point, it's not all about cybersecurity risks. Hamish didn't mention cybersecurity in there once. So although that's been getting a lot of the spotlight lately, we know that physical personnel information and natural hazards play key risks for organizations to manage. How do you recommend organizations prioritize these key risks?
It's such a big question, Dave, because those risks are so integrated as well. I think the first part of it really starts with our people. Our people are our most important asset, and I hate to say that sort of cliched term, but they really are the most important people within an organisation because they control systems and they control information and flows, and so we need to ensure there's strong education that there's a clear risk management plan in place and how the C-suite or the executives of an organisation approach their risk management frameworks. What's their risk appetite? Do they understand what information they hold? How they're connected to second, third, and fourth party vendors or groups that manage that information. So it really is about an integrated risk management planning process that emphasises education and also a culture around what's important in terms of how they manage their people, their information security, their physical security, etc., particularly for those big critical infrastructure entities.
The three of you are just really making my role here so easy today. You're just feeding one into the other. So thank you for that. And that provides the perfect segue to Gav. And this wasn't rehearsed, I might add. The people man, the founder and creator of the resilience concept and culture in organizations. Gav, if I could throw to you, considering the concept of resilience, how can organizations integrate and activate again might seem like the wrong word, but engage their workforce to proactively prepare for and mitigate risks to this critical infrastructure aspect?
Great, thanks, Dave. And conscious of both Hamish and Leanne's points leading up to this, we have seen a continuously volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and increasingly digital world continue to evolve around us. And we can't separate the digital anymore. So those who have seen me speak and know what I like to talk about, the idea of volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous has underpinned a lot of where we're at. But digital is embedded in everything now. So I think one of the key pieces we need to be thinking about is not necessarily how do we move to what, from a resilience perspective, is more proactive prevention, opportunity centrism, but let's just look at three states: compliance, resilience, and presilience. There's this idea that compliance is simply ticking a box, but not actually having the mechanisms in place to give you assurance and peace of mind. If we do this right, we align compliance with the resilience outcome that enables opportunity. So we should stop looking at these things as separate pieces. And again, kudos to CISC. As part of one of the TISNs, we had a look at, and we were shown the new organizational resilience tool. And it's a great tool. It's something that's useful for organizations to be able to at least have a baseline or benchmark of how their interdependent pieces intersect. So I think one of the challenges we've got, Dave, at the moment is that we're still stuck in a compliance mindset of what are the pieces of paper I need to be able to tick a box so that the regulator won't come after me, as opposed to what do I need to do to make sure that bad things don't happen. If they do happen, I'll minimize the impact, and that we learn so quickly and effectively that they will never happen again. And we seem to have lost that flavor. And it does seem like there's a bit of a scramble now for compliance instead of what we need, which is actually a resilient best practice type structure that is too hard to attack. And if it does get attacked, bounces back so quickly that the opposition go, that's too hard to go after. So, in terms of cultural change or where we've got to go, we've got to know current state and desired state. We've got a lot of work to do, I believe, still. Thanks, Dave. That's probably enough to get us started.
And you certainly haven't let me down with that flow, because that really brings me in. Hamish, I'm going to bring you in over here. We want to try and move away from that prescriptive, tick the box, follow the bouncy ball approach to developing a good infrastructure within our organization. We want to deal with good risk management. So, and we know that these sort of things happen from the top down largely. What are the areas where company directors should be looking for when they consider their first SoCI annual report for the risk management program, as well as more generally when looking at risk management?
Well, I hear so many questions from people about, we've got to start our risk management from scratch. And so the the first thing to say, I think, for company directors and boards and governing authorities is, what do you already do? And how do you think about risk and pulling it all together? And Gav, it's great you've played with the organisational resilience tool, because that's about how do you bring it all together in one place and give a view of risk. And so the idea of looking at material risks that impact the functioning on a day-to-day basis is really behind the principle of a risk management approach, and the risk management program is really just formalising that up to the board level. Because remember, we heard from so many of you, from chief security officers, from chief risk officers, from CISOs, to say, how do I get my board's attention? How do I get my CEO's attention? And this is meant to help you have that risk conversation. And we've kept it principles based because every risk and every company is different. But there are some foundational things for people to think about, and we want to really inspire a risk conversation, ideally every day, but we know at least annually that the board is clearly engaging in risks to the functioning of infrastructure in this country.
Thanks, Hamish. And Lee, if I could bring you in on that discussion as well. When we look at strategies, and particularly with your background in law enforcement, what are some of those key strategies that our audience can really pragmatically take back to their organizations with, that you believe are essential for enhancing, when I say security posture and better risk management posture?
I think there are just a few really key words here, and it won't be new or groundbreaking for anybody, but collaboration of effort is just essential. Sharing of intelligence or sharing of new ideas and innovations, and then coordination of those sorts of activities within an organisation and up through to the boards and company directors or executives of smaller organisations, and externally as well. So in Australia, we're too small to be able to do all of these things alone. And Gav touched on it before as well, the rapid change in tech and digital connectivity and international impacts and nefarious players and all those sorts of things. It's just too big for one organisation to try to manage all those risks on their own. And so I think probably a good example of this from my background was the coordinating efforts of the National Counterterrorism Coordinator originally in terms of terrorist and countering violent extremism at the height of those sorts of issues. We've now also got a fabulous National Cyber Coordinator whose role will be the same thing. So we have people who are key in government, who are at government level, definitely bringing together those entities. Now, sometimes externally in organisations, we're not going to see those activities or their impacts. But when we then start to branch out into the working groups and connecting with community to make sure that those sorts of government bodies are listening to what's actually happening on the ground, what's happening, in big event spaces, for example, was a good example there, where we had working groups looking at event management, control and flow of people at the height of terrorism where they were real targets, bringing people in from those entities to say, what will work for you well? These are some of the risks we're seeing. We can share some of that intelligence with you in a secure environment, but we need to understand your risk management, your plans, and we will help give you some advice and guidance. But organisations like government can't do it separately to private sector. And then we just get finally to, that coordination of activities, and the cybersecurity coordinator, and Hamish will be able to speak to this better than I will. But again, working with big tech companies, there's a lot of legislation and regulation in place, but it's actually building those trusted networks where we are working together and sharing those innovations, but also identifying what the vulnerabilities and risks are. So we make sure those sort of entities understand the why we need to do this as well. So Hamish, you've probably got more to add about some of those aspects, but I know that's big picture level as well. Then if I guess Gav will bring it down into into an organisational level. At the organisational level, you have to have understanding of your own systems, your own information, how they are connected, who are you connecting to external to your organisation, and how you can contribute to other organisations in terms of that expertise or gathering that information and learning from them.
Thanks, Lee. And Gav, I'm going to throw it to you in a second, but before I do, perhaps you can incubate on that for a second, on that embedding part and how we create that culture. But just to keep the flow on what Lee was saying, Hamish, if you could just jump in there on that tech aspect of it. You know, to Lee's point, we're not a country that has enough sovereign capability to deal with some of the technology and some of the advancements that we need to. How do we go around deciding what good looks like for us?
Well, what a great question. And I think for each individual company, there's a decision point about what technology you want to use, what risk you're willing to accept, and how that interacts with the rest of your ICT and OT technology. So that's kind of at an individual company level. One of the things we're working on, particularly through the trusted information sharing network that Gav mentioned before, is what are the common and interdependent technologies, particularly SaaS and PaaS providers, that are common across industry? Can we actually collaborate on understanding our risk exposure and starting to think about, can we actually ask some of the, particularly the big multinational companies that are common, can we get a better insight into your security posture, which will help us? And so I think that's a really great way to start, and it's about supply chain risk. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing that I increasingly look at, people think about, well, what would happen if a piece of technology stopped working or is a gateway into the rest of our infrastructure? And increasingly, I'm talking to people who think about risk mitigants, particularly in the physical world. So if you think about, for example, a crane at a major maritime port in Australia, internet connected, potentially remote controlled from an alternate location, is there a way that you could sever that crane from the internet and operate it manually as a backup? What does that look like? How do we look at all different types of scenarios? So I think a really complex question, but the principle is, what would happen if it's not there? What would happen if that's a gateway to the rest of my business and my technology stack? And how do I start to build up, to the people point, a much better culture around zero trust in our technological environment?
And I think you've just started another topic for another webinar there, which I'd love to unpack at a later stage, but that's great. But just understanding that, following on from what both you and Leanne were saying, we've now got these concepts and we've now got this, but we need a train of thought. We need a way to embed this as a standard practice in our organizations. Gav, if I could bring you in on this one, what does good risk management and security resilience look like? And how do we really embed this in an organization as business as usual?
Great. So I think the first starting point is that there is no one size fits all approach to this. And I think we've got to change the perception that if I just do whatever someone else did, I'm going to be okay. Right? The challenges we've got are complex and evolving. So even if I just do what somebody else did, and we've had a client say to us, "Oh, Home Affairs has looked over our stuff. We're not worried." We're going, "Well, that's wonderful. That's great that you're working with the regulator collaboratively, but have you looked at what AEST and AEST have released today? Things have changed in the minute or two that you've stopped talking to the regulator." So part of the challenge we've got here is this is evolving and constantly changing. There are minimum principles and standards and baseline pieces that are worked into the legislation and should just be best practice. And I'd probably like to go on the record and say that I'm still gobsmacked that this idea of having a risk management plan is something that organizations are intimidated by. It should just be good business. If you're not thinking about what could help me or what could hurt me across a full domain, which is your all hazards approach, and we should, again, not confuse all hazards with having a risk mitigation management plan for every single risk you can identify. It's about looking at what could hurt you and help you and focusing on that first. And then as you mature, you can expand it into other aspects. Obviously, we're lucky in some ways because the regulation itself has told us where we need to focus. Right, we need to focus on those 4 rules, 4 pillars, 4 areas of responsibility, and it's told us also we need to do certain things like exercise, report, etc. The challenge is contextualizing that for each organization. So really, really quickly, the biggest challenge I see in play now is lack of understanding around what good risk management looks like at a strategic level. There are almost everyone we've spoken to is good at risk management from an operational level. They've been running their organization for a long time. They know, for example, if I'm a water utility, I know exactly what engineering specs I need and which parts of my infrastructure need to be working. What hasn't happened, primarily due to historical saltwater insulation, we're an island, we've been pretty safe. And also, Australians are nice people. Hope we haven't been targeted as harshly as many of our other Five Eyes partners might have been historically. That's all changed in the last 10 years. Just look around at the world we're in today. It is fundamentally different to what it was even just after COVID, and it will continue to change. Organizations cannot keep thinking the way they used to do things will be good enough for the way we need to do things now. And we need two sets of operating ideas. One, we need the set and forget stuff that we've been doing for a long time. And most organizations we've looked at have actually got that in play. They're just not giving themselves credit and translating that into their overall risk management plan. The second problem we've got, though, is this idea that we have to have all the answers and we have to be confident that we can identify every risk or we'll get in trouble if we don't. We need to have the ability to stretch and flex. And when we're facing disruptions, and that could be an attack, it could be the weather, it could be staff members all getting COVID and not coming to work. There are so many things that could disrupt you. We need to know we have continuity. So practically, what does good look like? It looks like everyone in that organization aligning to achieve an integrated objective, which by default, security and resilience should be part of it. I cannot understand why organizations are feeling this is an impost when I've run businesses for 20 years. If we don't understand our risks, your business will not be successful. So this is a business success piece, not a regulatory piece. And if we can change the mindset, we can get some good outcomes. I see Hamish is raring to go there. So
yeah, I just want to build on that point, Gav, because it's so interesting that, and this is really weird to say coming from a regulator, but you can walk into a boardroom and you can feel whether or not there's a culture of risk, thinking about risk, mitigating risk, and a culture of curiosity. And one of the really interesting insights we learned from some of the first exercises we did is everyone had the technical response actually down pat. But the emotional response, what you'd say to the media, how you'd tell staff, who you'd tell, who you'd call, where you'd report it, were all areas of people kind of struggling. So the business was fine technically, but if you lose all of those other bits, you kind of actually lose the battle.
There's so much wisdom in that. Sorry, Lee.
So no, Gav, this is the only trouble with a webinar sometimes. I couldn't agree more, and we were sort of mulling over this issue a little bit earlier today, and talked about cybersecurity and AEST's maturity risk levels, and us giving an example. So I sit on a range of boards and audit committees, and one of them is a really large entity, and they've got the most amazing CISO and chief tech officer, and so I won't name them because definitely don't want anyone to be stealing them out there. But this is a really big entity in Australia, but they don't try to aspire to get maturity level 3 across all of the risk domains in their cyber area. They've made some really considered decisions about what's an appropriate investment for that organisation, what are some other risk treatments, maybe at a level 1 or 2, depending on the risk factors. And so it's complex, but when you start to break it down and not think I have to get to that top level, and then an organisation's executives really get nervous or don't understand what that means because they haven't asked the right questions. You don't need to be at that top level, even for a big entity. You just need to understand and rely on those experts and all the other information that's available to you.
Can I segue in there quickly? That point about relying on experts, one of the things we've found over time is that nobody knows your business better than you. And you can bring in external parties, we do that, but we will not know your business the way you know your business. And realistically, the way to get a good outcome is to get the best working together. The benefit an external party brings is that there's a little bit of managed bias, there's a fresh set of eyes, and there's some independence. The benefit that you bring is you own the asset. You are responsible when things go wrong, and you are the ones who have to scramble to make sure it keeps going, which is why it's so important for this not to fall into the trap that we like to refer to as risk theatre, where we're pretending we're managing things because we've got documents in place or we've invested in some sort of software. Hardware works the same way too. You know, often we are told, oh, our fences are excellent and our cameras are great and we've got security guards. And then you ask the question of what are you protecting against, for what, why? Because you could have those things. And one of the sites we did look at was a remote site that realistically had such robust natural geographic protection because it was so far that they'd way overexpended on physical security and way underexpended on cyber. So it's an interesting piece. There's not one size fits all, but I would urge you, as you're thinking about this, think of a partner-based approach that leverages the best of expertise and the best of your own understanding, and make sure you can actually do what you're saying you're going to do. One of the biggest things we've seen from, you name the Banking Royal Commission, the Aged Care Royal Commissions, all of them, the biggest failures are often where organizations say they are managing something or say they've risk assessed it and then don't do what they say based on their own documentation. So rather be conservative and solve a problem in a way you can solve a problem to the best of your ability, than get into the habit of thinking it's got to be perfect because a regulator's coming to look at it. I'm sure Hamish probably got a comment on that.
Oh, totally. And our first couple of years were about building awareness and education, and now we're moving into audit and compliance, not for a punitive impact, but to see how people are implementing it, where we can actually improve, where we can provide better guidance, and where we can get a sense about the implementation of the regime. We certainly don't have a got-you approach. We don't focus on enforcement and punitive areas unless you're blatantly non-compliant and obstinate about that fact, and we haven't come across anyone, so thank you. But we're interested as a regulator to think about security and resilience, and so that's what we prioritise over everything else.
And Tony Pierce has asked a really great question, but Tony, I'm going to come to your question in a second. And for those of you that still want to send your questions through, please keep them coming. There's some really good questions coming through there. But we're on a theme, and I definitely want to keep running with this theme. Hamish, to your point, we're in the state of almost fearing Dunning-Kruger. We've got, and to Gav's point, using that risk theatre type environment, thinking we've got everything perfectly sorted out. It looks like we've got everything sorted out, but when we actually cover and lift up that stone, we see a lot of mess. Let's just talk about that partnership aspect that Gav you brought up, and I know Hamish, you very much across collaboration and working together, and government and industry working together, and partners working together. Lee, if I could throw to you next, in terms of this collaboration and partnership amongst different organizations, what role do you see for different sectors in strengthening our critical infrastructure security?
It really comes down to what are the most effective partnerships as well. Where do you expend your time and energy in reaching out and building those partnerships? And there are so many, because organisations in the critical infrastructure space are complex. So first of all, I know that there's already great partnerships with tech industry, and that's been driven primarily because some of our critical infrastructure organisations, so they're not experts in digital technologies and all that, data centres, etc. So that's been a really excellent growth area, and partnerships where they come together and they workshop things, and that's proven to be really successful in protecting tech, etc. I think one of the other things is, as again, prioritising who your key partners are and getting involved. So reaching out, whether there's working groups or other things, you have to build some of those networks yourself, not just be passive and wait for information to come to you. We always learn better when we're collectively sharing ideas and innovation. And I totally understand, intellectual property and all those sorts of things, protecting businesses and the outcomes you want to achieve as a business. But there's other ways that people should be coming together and sharing intelligence, sharing the way to do better, and getting involved, reaching out through the TISN network for this particular topic, around critical infrastructure. You get a lot of information, you get a great network, you find out where you can go to build on that network face to face as well, how you can get involved. participate in forums, etc., where you're going to learn about what's going on and share your ideas and innovations as well.
And I think, Lee, to your point there, I think it's critically important to understand that this isn't a competition. This isn't a case of I can do mine better than yours. It's a case of how do we work collaboratively. To Gav's point that he made, no one knows your business better than you do. So you know your business well, but collaborate and work with other stakeholders to get the best for your business so that they can get the best for theirs. I want to throw to you some great questions coming through now. Tony Pierce has asked a really good question, which I really like, and I think that each one of you will put a different spin on it. So Hamish, if I can start off with you first.
Sure.
Tony's asked, we are very good. We're very good at assuring individual aspects or systems, IT, people, etc. However, what we don't do well is assure systems of systems. In some areas of Australia, big inroads are being made predominantly in the natural hazard environment. Do you have a view on how we get organizations to appreciate better that assuring systems of systems is critical to reducing community and sector vulnerability? And from a government's perspective, increasing community confidence in government. Hamish, first.
Absolutely. What a great question, Tony, because I talk to so many people who don't even understand their estate, their technology estate, what systems are running, what software is running on your system, which kind of gets to people who worship on the altar of the Essential 8 only. Don't actually get to the very heart of this question, which is hunting for threats, which is about contemplating what would happen if a system failed. How do you bounce back better? How do you actually think about the protection of crown jewels? And how do you think about systems in a layered sense? So I really like your question because it gets to the very heart of what we've been talking about here today, which is how do you be curious? How do you think about things going wrong in a systemic sense? I don't have the answer for you about how do you secure systems of systems because given the complexity of organisations, and I sit in Home Affairs with a $600 million technology estate over 500 systems, and I know how complex things are, we're thinking about, well, what are the key ones? And what are the feeders into those key systems? So how do we protect them first? Exactly to Gav's point. How do we think about incident response and how do we go hunting for things that should not be there? So I think it's a great question, but there are some tips from my perspective.
Gav, I can see you chomping at the bit there. Can I throw it to you for comment?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very much enjoying the non-choreographed dance between Leanne, Hamish, and myself. And the fact that it's not choreographed, I think, brings it a nice flavour. But just building off Hamish's point there about systems of systems, and Tony, you know, you're an incredibly experienced government expert in many of these things, and you get to ask the questions that are harder for most people to answer, and this is certainly one of those. There are a few variables that I think we do need to take into account. One of those first ones is this idea of what good does look like, and I would bring in, you know, without risk nerding out too hard, if you can't determine your own appetites and tolerances, and if you can't determine your strategic objectives and how risk ties back to those, you can land up spending millions and millions of dollars trying to secure something that actually can't be secured to the level you think you can, or you can over-secure something which leaves more vulnerabilities elsewhere because you've used resources that are finite. So this is a balancing act. Anybody who tells you there's unlimited budget to solve these problems is probably not living in the real world, mainly because the problem of tomorrow hasn't been identified yet. We're still grappling with actually the problems of yesterday. We're not even dealing with the problems of today. And Hamish, I wanted to give you a high five over the screen because the idea of moving from a passive victim to where you're waiting and hoping nothing bad happens to you, to somebody who is actively seeking out these things that could hurt you, removing them, minimizing, mitigating them, is the shift into that resilient space you asked about earlier, Dave. But to get there, you've got to get your ducks in a row, right? You've got to have the basic compliance pieces in place so that you know, for example, you can comply with whether it's NIST 27,000, doesn't matter. You need one structure that enables you to go, we've reached a baseline. We've reached a level that is acceptable, and we've got a regulator that's told us what those are. Thanks, that makes it easy, right? The next step we've got to test and assure. And I think this is an important piece because testing and assuring if we don't know what we're testing and assuring, only creates stress, chaos, and panic. And realistically, it's great to test and it's great to audit and assure, having been part of all of those processes many times. If we are not clear about what we've built and what we're testing, we tend to just offside people, frustrate them, or make them feel negative about these things. So I think there's a lot of moving pieces before we can get to systems of systems. And, you know, I think realistically, asset owners, while they need to understand they are part of a system of systems and develop what we like to refer to as tactical thinking, strategic and tactical combined. If we're doing something on the ground, what does it do to our strategy? And if we're doing something on the strategy, what does it do to the ground? I'd probably say this tactical gap is one of the biggest ones we've seen to date. And it makes systems of systems assurance almost impossible. So, you know, if we don't start with everybody fixing their own backyards, being comfortable that they've got a risk managed posture that is accurate based on their vulnerabilities and threats and evolving. That's the starting point. If you can get that, I would be gobsmacked if any regulator would go, you're not meeting a minimum standard, it's not acceptable. And then the next step on that is then we can contribute to the whole and we can start going, right, holistically, we are more secure than we were before. But it does take a level of honesty. It also takes a level of maturity. And we mentioned boards earlier. It's great to see guidance like the ARCD Cyber for Boards guidance coming out. What really does worry me, and this will be my parting point on this one, is that, yes, don't get me wrong, we have a cyber business. We're looking at cyber all the time, and it is probably one of the fastest evolving threat areas out there right now. There's no question about it. But things like workplace violence, things like mental health, things like productivity, employee absenteeism, disgruntlement, insider threat, they haven't gone away just because cyber threat vectors are increasing. And most of these things are intersecting and interwoven. And I would really be urging those of you listening to this, think about integrated risk management. There are many things you can do that will reduce the likelihood of workplace violence and cybercrime. There are many things you could do that will increase mental health and cohesion. So if we treat every risk separately, you'll never have enough budget. You're going to land up in a pile of pain continuously. You need to look at how we integrate these things. And ultimately, the goal should be to get to that resilience mindset Hamish described, where you're so comfortable with your compliance and your resilience, your ability to bounce back after something bad happening, that you can now focus on preventing bad things from happening and learning from what's happening to others to evolve and adapt. If we can get to that point, we will simply become too much of a hard target for foreign state actors to move. But I'd say we have a long way to go. And in fairness, I haven't seen that anywhere in the world, but I have seen parts of it demonstrated really well by certain organizations, agencies, and companies. Thanks, Dave.
Lee, do you want to weigh in there from a different, we've had Hamish's perspective, we've had Gav's perspective. I know with your background in law enforcement, you've definitely worked with complex systems and complicated systems of systems. How does that look to you?
Yeah, so and as we were talking, I was thinking it through, harking back to those days a little bit. You know, policing is probably an excellent example of how much it's matured in terms of looking at integrated systems risk and looking at collaboration across and outside. So many decades ago, policing organisations, particularly in Australia, would only speak to each other or only with internally. They had this distrust around external partnerships and working with other groups. But just the rapid nature of change, and particularly in the digital world, as well as a few royal commissions in relation to how police work and operate, has opened that up and matured the way that they do think about managing risks, working collaboratively with others, being able to share intelligence and information appropriately, and learning from others. And so that's been a huge cultural shift. And so I think that's just an example that it can take place. You need strong leaders with a culture focused on those aspects, and willing to take decisions and some risks in that space, but also saying that these are expectations, and, you know, these are the left and right of arc that you can operate within, and you can't, and building those strong partnerships and trusted relationships going forward. And so we now see much better policing outcomes, I feel. Is it perfect? No, no system or organisation ever is, because it's all made up of humans. And at the end of the day, we're never going to solve this issue. it's always going to be constantly building networks, building trusted relationships and partnerships, etc., and evolving as our social, technological, economic environments evolve through time as well.
Thanks, Lee. And with just under 20 minutes to go, I'm going to ask each one of Hamish, Gav and Leanne just to start thinking about a capstone takeaway that you'd want our audience to go, but not yet. Just give you a bit of time there. Let's take the conversation. We've spoken about people risks. We've spoken about cyber, but we've spoken about physical security. Let's talk a little bit about natural disasters, which is really relevant in the Act. According to NEMA, natural disasters cost Australia about $38 billion per year on average, with the cost estimated, and this is a question from Sinet, with the cost estimated to reach at least $73 billion by 2060. Are there any examples of programs or initiatives can organizations take to manage these challenges within security of critical infrastructure organizations? Hamish, can I kickstart that with you?
Yeah, a really great question, because you obviously can't necessarily prevent a natural hazard from occurring, but you can prepare for it. And the best examples we see are people who have integrated that thinking into their broader risk thinking, and they think about it in terms of what's the likelihood, but if we were struck by a storm or a natural hazard or a fire, how would we operate? And so I think the big idea behind it is exactly like the cyber discussion we were having. How would you bounce back? What is your redundancy? Where are things kept? Are they kept in the same place? So, for example, do you have the encryption keys for a network kept in one place? Do you need to think about having that in two? Same thing for the physical files you might have, or a digitized environment. Is moving to the cloud actually going to help us, just like it helped Ukraine, in a natural hazard environment? So thinking logically around events will happen. What would happen if that was to occur, and how do we think about it in the future? And then if you were kind of struck by a fire or a natural hazard that had a successful impact, if you like, how do we build back? Do we build back in the same place? Do we think about doing something differently to make us much more prepared for the future? And kind of going to response, NEMA has great advice about mitigation, building back better, and actually understanding the different types of funds that might be able to help, both disaster ready, but also response as well.
And that's great, Gav. I'm going to bring you in here just on that point. Hamish made a really good point there, is that we can't prevent all bad things from happening. Bad things are going to happen. So with that in mind, how would you go about preparing your infrastructure?
So I think there's a few pieces we've got to accept. Yes, inevitably, if you are in, for example, I live in Brisbane, and I moved to Brisbane in 2008. And since I've been here, I believe we've had 3 in 100-year floods. So I've only been here about 15 years, but I've had that 3 times now. You would really be thinking that we'd be going, right, if this is the frequency and the norm of events we're facing, let's get smarter in a few different things. So I like to, as many of you know, I like to think at different levels. So let's think about the individual. What am I doing? Like, we're all part of this national ecosystem, and it's every citizen's responsibility to be keeping Australia safe, resilient, and successful. So if individuals can't take personal responsibility, but they work for a critical infrastructure entity, we're not going to see an intersection here. So if you've got any staff working for you that don't know how to do this for themselves, we've already got our first potential failure point. Because if they can't leave their home, if they've got no internet, if they are flooded, if their house burns down, the list goes on. Supply chain, PERSEC, you name it, we're in a pile of pain. Okay, the second then would be small groups or units. Most systems of national significance related asset owners are comparatively bigger entities with hundreds, if not thousands, of people working for them. Right, so if you can't translate the individual back to teams, units, or subdivisions and go, which are our most risky activities? Which of our assets are in the riskiest areas for fire, flooding, or any other sort of disaster? And let's put our effort into those instead of go, here's the generic fire prevention, flood prevention plan for the entire business. It's going to cost us millions. but it actually only will likely affect four sites, for example. So it's that cascading or the transition from individual to organization that will create a national outcome for us. Is that easy to do? No. And is that something, honestly, that federal government, state governments, and local governments can do for us? No. We have to be able to do it together. And that's probably a segue to hand to Lee, because I know she's had direct experience managing flood recovery and might have some good insight on this idea.
And I'm just thinking about it again from a board and an audit committee perspective. The sorts of big critical infrastructure entities we're talking about have large support groups internally. Hamish touched on it before. It's about preparation, planning, scenario and exercising, running those scenarios internally as Gav's identifying there. You have to also trust those external experts that you've brought in. If you've got an audit and risk committee, does the chief executive meet with that person and listen to those independent external perspectives of where those risks are? And it might be a different perspective when you're internally day-to-day dealing with managing the organisation on that daily basis. So bringing in those experts, but actually asking them questions, listening to them. You might not always agree, and that's okay too, but it helps you to set a tempo for where you're going to put a bit of effort, prioritise, resourcing, etc. So bring in some of those right advisors. And also it's not a set and forget for those advisors too. We've seen some recent examples in the media about how people have had people on boards for 20, 30 years across a range of sectors. That's not healthy, because you become a part of that organisation. So replenishing, getting those fresh people in with different levels of expertise, depending on what you perceive are the major risk areas, capabilities that you need to be looking at and assessing and saying, are we right or not? So it's incumbent on executives of organisations, boards, etc., to have those hard conversations regularly and to ask questions, but to listen to the advice they're getting and then make appropriate or informed decisions.
Thanks, Lee. And I want to take one more question from the audience quickly, and I've really got a question which I'd like us to tackle before our time runs out. This hourglass is running out very, very quickly. Will's asked the question, how can organizations take full advantage of digital networks and emerging technologies while also ensuring the safety of their data and operations? Hamish, do you want to have the first bite at the apple?
Yeah, another great question, because digital networks can be much more secure, but the big trick is to think about security upfront and to think about data security upfront, to think about how you're going to use a digital network or an emerging technology like AI to facilitate the economic outcomes or the service delivery or the customer facing part of your business. And that's a really great thing, but matching that with how are we going to secure it at the same time? What are the policies and procedures we can put in up front that can help us become much more prosperous and much more secure? Because if you kind of fail to do that up front, it's going to cost a lot more down the track. And I think that that's a skill that particularly the people I talk to in the security side of a business aren't necessarily talking to those in the economic side of a business or in a government department. So matching and being a matchmaker in those relationships and bringing people together, I think, is the best thing that you can do. It gets back to the culture, and it gets back to a culture of collaboration and collaboration early, particularly with those IT professionals who'd rather look at their computers than talk to a person.
Gav, all yours?
What Hamish said. But in fairness, just building on that for a second, I'm pretty sure you must be somebody who works on the security, data, IT, technology side of the house. I think we need to be realistic about where we are. And this is part of the challenge. Almost every tech expert we speak to would love to create systems that engineer humans out of the system and are resistant and self-securing. The challenge we've got in the current world is humans are using those systems. We are the users of those systems. So we're not at a phase where the human interaction or the human intersection is no longer the critical input. So we've got to be really careful, because you take almost any app on your mobile phone, you take almost any software program you're using, it has more usability capability than users are already using it for now. So most of the software and the technology has already overleaped human capability. And I've got to say with a lot of confidence on this one, over the last 5 years, if I'd had $1 for every time I'd seen somebody implement a governance risk management type system or a risk quantification system or an incident response system and go, sorted, we're done, we've bought the software now, we're good, and then nobody uses it or it's not used correctly. And I know, Dave, you often talk about GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Like if your system is not being fed the right inputs, it's not going to give you the right outputs. So I would urge our technological experts to make sure that the humans and the process and policies come with any sort of piece, because we've already moved too fast on the tech side for most humans to keep up. And that's what's causing so many vulnerabilities. There should be no reason somebody clicks on a phishing email ever, yet it's still one of the most common and successful attack vector methods out there. So we've got to also just be careful that we keep these things in balance. You know, tech people, whichever standard you pick up has got some version of people process tech in it. It's sort of becoming an interesting thing that most of the conversation we have with tech people are, yeah, it's people process tech, but it's all about the tech, right? And we're sort of going, no, it's all about the outcome. What is the outcome we want? So just keep that in mind. And Hamish's point on silo busting, really, really important. If we cannot tie security outcomes and risk strategies back to the organization's goals and outputs, we might keep a regulator happy, but funding will evaporate and confidence in your services to the organization will be degraded. Keep thinking this is about business and national security and resilience and good outcomes. It's not binary about one or the other. That's it for me, Dave. Thanks.
And what I'm hearing continuously is don't get caught in the trap that there's a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet to any of this. Sorry, I keep saying last question, but so many great questions are coming through, and this is a webinar for you, our audience, so I definitely do want to get to them. Paul's asked the question, there's a significant overlap between SoCI and CPS 234. Do you think Australia is ready or needs a safe harbor approach similar to that of the US? Hamish, if I can throw to you on that one first.
Yeah, well, that's another interesting question. So 234 and SoCI are interoperable in the sense that no one who's subject to the prudential regulation or prudential standard is also regulated then by SoCI. We rely on things like prudential regulation, like very detailed regulations that exist, and SoCI is there to bridge the gap at a whole of economy level, particularly where there aren't regulations that are already in place. And so we work very closely, including through the Council of Financial Regulators, plus includes Home Affairs and OAIC and ACCC, trying to work on regulation, harmonisation, making sure that the system as a whole, whether it's 230, which is about organisational resilience, or 234 about IT and systems, that we're actually trying to ask the same things. My best kind of outcome, which I'm pushing my fellow regulators for, is by 2030 we should have harmonised legislation which, no matter where you work in the economy, it's clear that here are the organisational resilience requirements, here are the supply chain requirements, here are the IT requirements. And if we do that, Australia will be a much more economically prosperous nation, because people can invest because they know what the standards are and they can actually adhere to them. But that's a bit of an aspiration that I have.
And another webinar which I'd like to take on that as well. Lee, just before we wrap up, I really want to ask, you know, when we think about critical infrastructure, we think about large organizations, big resources, lots of money, lots of infrastructure. But not all critical infrastructure organizations are big. Some of them are these small to medium-sized enterprises. From your experience, working on all the boards that you're on and your background in law enforcement, you've seen a lot and you've done a lot. From your experience, what approach to the legislation works best in a small to medium-sized organization that have a small amount of people, a limited amount of people and resources and budget?
First of all, I'd say don't get overwhelmed. Those small to medium enterprises can be some of the leaders in how to do really effective risk management, security planning, communications across their organisation, because they can actually reach the organisation. But taking a point that Gav made earlier, sometimes we're a little bit over-ambitious as well. So actually thinking through, for a small organisation, working with your people. If you need to bring in an expert or two, you can. You can certainly look at all of the information that's widely available on websites, depending on what the question or the issue is you're trying to solve at that point, and see what others are doing or some guidance for you. So don't try to take on too much at once. Look at what are those risk factors or issues that are really critical to your organisation. What's the top 5 and how are you treating them? And then work through the next 5 after that. But, coming back every 12 months, as Hamish said earlier, to just make sure, are we still looking at those same risks? Are our treatments working? Not just having a compliance regime. I've got a beautiful risk management plan. I never look at it. I never understand what, it's a high risk for people injury, for example. And what are the treatments you're putting in place for that? At the end, is it still, are you going to minimise that risk or not? Is that what you're working towards? How much resource? The people at the top of the organisation, if they ask a question, they're focused on it, everybody within that organisation, small, medium or large, will focus on it. But yeah, so you've just really got to also have a look at where is the best spend, if it's new tech or it's new piece of equipment or something, is that actually going to achieve what you want it to achieve? And having a review mechanism built in so that you do say, has that achieved what we want it to achieve?
And Hamish, if I could ask you for one answer to a very simple question from Nati Victor. We attended the CIPRNA conference in the US and it was exceptional. Do you think that CISC would follow and run a similar conference for Australia?
Really happy to. This year we're bringing it to you and having smaller roundtables. Next year we're back to a full conference, so absolutely.
Right, hope we answered that. Now, as we wrap it up, Gav, if I could start off with you, your capstone thought and your key takeaway that you believe that our audience would get the greatest value of leaving this webinar today and feeling comfortably uncomfortable with where they are, not overwhelmed with the submission.
Sure. So I think bearing in mind we're about 1.5 years on since we ran the first series of webinars trying to educate people on the SoCI legislation, integrated risk, pragmatic strategic risk decision making, and how all these pieces come together. There's no question in my head we've moved a little bit forward. I will say a little bit forward because in some ways, for example, I think the sophistication of CISC with the support tools, the growth of CISC and the support CISC is offering is totally different to what it was 1.5 years, which is great. That's significant forward movement. I would say there's also an acceptance in the market now that this has to be done, as opposed to can we push back against this and try and pretend it won't happen or won't affect us, which is a significant move forward. But my one capstone point is that this will continue to change and will continue to evolve. Threat actors will continue to find different ways to find our vulnerabilities. So don't build something for the compliance frameworks of yesterday. Build something that can change and adapt and morph for not just what's here today, but what's coming tomorrow. Is that easy? No. Okay? But if you balance that compliance, resilience, mindset, and you start addressing it in an integrated way that covers all 3 of those, you're moving in a direction that you will be successful, because even if something goes wrong, you're going to learn. And if you've already identified those critical risks and you've got mitigations and response capabilities there, business assurance, continuity, and arguably if you've been named as part of a system of national significance, the continuity of the country is secured. And I'd just like to thank Hamish and Leanne and you, Dave, and the team for putting this on, and the audience for listening. There's lots of information here, but the truth of all this stuff is it's not a theory subject. It's a doing subject, and you can theoretically plan to secure your infrastructure, but if you don't implement, it's not secure. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, you've helped me with my thank you. So we saved time there. Lee, if I could throw it to you for a closing comment.
Oh, thanks, Dave. And I was actually going to help on the thanking comment as well, because we're focused on what the audience can take away. Thank you for participating. I think, that's a huge first step. It shows you're really interested and committed, wanting to help your organisations to do better. So I think my takeaway advice really is, building on what Hamish said earlier, be curious, ask questions, but also be courageous. A little courageous goes a long way in your organisations to challenge the status quo about these issues. and bring forward ideas and new ways. You might not nail it first time, or people might not listen to you first time, and that's okay too. But if it's worth investing energy and time in because you see a big risk or vulnerability, keep that conversation going in your organisations and participate in appropriate, activities external to your organisation as well, where you're building that knowledge and ideas and innovation.
Hamish, over to you for final thoughts.
Well, I'm just going to issue a challenge, and that is we've all got performance agreements of some sort. How do we build change in culture and cultural risk reset into our performance framework? I'm going to give it a shot this year. Hope you do too. So thanks so much for your time. Great to be here on such a great panel with Dave, Gavin, and Leanne.
Fantastic, and that's really the high note that I was looking for, Hamish. You certainly didn't fail there, so thank you. Just again to echo Gav's sentiments, a massive thank you to Hamish, Gav and Leanne for your time. I know it's not easy to fit this into your diary, but this is a true example of collaboration between private sector, government, and obviously our audience as well. So a big thank you to you for giving of your time to be here this morning. Operations like this and events like this don't just happen on the fly. There's a lot of work that goes into creating a production of this nature. So to Janita and Cherry behind the scenes in the production studio, thank you for so professionally putting this event together. We really appreciate it. It doesn't end here, as Gav mentioned. This is a doing, not a theoretical piece. The next webinar is taking place on the 8th of May, so just under a month from today. And we start to deep dive into each of the aspects and the domains with our subject matter experts in each of the domains of security of critical infrastructure. To Leanne's point, it's not an elephant that has to be eaten all at once. It can be done bit by bit. There's tons of help on the CISC website, and a massive thank you to the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre for all the support and information that they do provide. It definitely does make the journey a lot easier. And on that final note, 3 minutes over, I do apologize. I'd like to thank you all for your time, for your attendance today, and we look forward to seeing you on upcoming events. So thank you.